Okay, Mike, I guess it's your turn.
Hey, Rick, I'm going to just tell you what photo number to put up.
Okay, fine.
And then I'll just give you a cue and you can go ahead and pull it down so you don't have to leave them up the whole time.
Okay, we'll do.
All right, so welcome to the National Electronics Museum. As you guys know, we're still closed, but hopefully that won't be forever. And we'll be able to open up here again soon. What I'm going to be talking to you guys about tonight is a little bit about some of these countermeasure pods that we have in the museum. And we're going to be talking about electronic warfare in Vietnam, but only part of it. It's only going to be a short segment of the entire experience in Vietnam. In fact, it's kind of remarkable on how short of a period of time a lot of this stuff went down. And hey, Sam, I can hear myself like coming back. Yeah. Check, 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 check. Yeah, that works a lot better. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the Cold War. Some of you guys probably remember that. Mm-hmm. I certainly don't. The late 1950s, the military was interested in what type of radar the Soviets used and had and how they worked. And they instituted an operation called Operation Wolf Flight. It's WOLF Flight. And Operation Wolf Flight was to try to figure out what Soviet radars were out there, how they transmitted. So if you can go to that first picture. Picture number 1. Got it? There we go. I mean, this is a pretty classic picture of Tempelhof Airfield in what at the time was West Berlin. Now, a lot of these aircraft were doing more than just moving equipment and material to Berlin. The Air Force would have these flights from from West Germany to West Berlin. And as the planes would flying, they would unravel these trailing antennas in hopes that the Soviets would turn their radars onto the aircraft while they were flying so they could get the frequencies and pulse rates and other information off the Soviet radars. Fortunately, the Soviets were a little too clever to actually paint many of the aircraft, but by the end of the 1950s, the Air Force had a pretty good idea of the types of radar that the Soviets were using. And one of those radars was given the code name Fansong, F-A-N-S-O-N-G. You can go ahead and pull this picture down. Now, the information that was collected about the Soviet radars was primarily collected for the Strategic Air Command's use. The idea being that they would put equipment onto aircraft which would attack the Soviet Union in the event of a nuclear war. So this was a SAC project. This was not, as we'll see, a TAC project, which is the Tactical Air Command. Those guys were doing something different than what SAC did, and it created some issues later on in the war. So go ahead and put up number 2. There we go. This is the backside of the Fansong radar. Now, the Fansong radar was given the Soviet designation SRN-75. You'll notice that has a number of different antennas. This particular radar was designed as a fire control and tracking radar for a missile system called the SA-2 guideline, which was the NATO designation for this particular missile. So if you want to throw up picture number 3, that is an SA-2 missile on the back of a carrier. I believe that that missile is a little bit shorter than what was encountered in in Vietnam because I think the booster is missing, or the launching part of the rocket is missing on that. The Air Force referred to that as the flying telephone. That was a high altitude air defense weapon with a proximity fuse. They were built in 1957. The first reported shoot down of an aircraft by one of these rockets was in 1957, and they are still being used in one form or another by various countries around the world. So you can go ahead and pull this one down. Now, based on this Wolf flight data that the Air Force had collected, they were able to develop a small handheld receiver which could pick up the frequencies that the Fansong radar transmit. And in 1960, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, these receivers were rushed into production. Now, these things were about the size of a small tape recorder, and they were put into the American aircraft, the surveillance aircraft. You can throw up picture number 5. Oops. Back up one. Maybe it's 4. Maybe I got that one. That's 4. And that's 5. Oh, you know what? There we go. Yeah, so that's the aircraft that they were put into. Now, these receivers were jury-rigged by the CIA. They were strapped to the pilot's legs. The antennas were painted, or the antennas were taped onto the cockpit windows. And these overflights of the Soviet Union were able, or not the Soviet Union, but of Cuba, the pilots were able to detect the Fansong radars, and it gave the pilots the ability to try to fly around the radars to avoid being shot down. So that was the first example of a receiver system designed by the military, which gave the pilots the ability to find and identify those radars. So you can go ahead and take this one down. In fact, go back to the one photo before I made a mistake. Go back to number 4. Yeah, so this is an aerial view of a radar site in Vietnam that shows the orientation of the radar with the missile launchers. So that circle in the center would have held the radar equipment, not only the Fansong, but there was another radar called the Spoon Rest, which I'll talk about in a minute. That was in the center of that circle. And then those small circles on the outer edge are the various missile launching sites. So each one, in this case, had 6 missile launchers for one radar antenna. So again, follow along on the dates here, because this is what really I find really fascinating about this whole story, is how quickly all of this transpired. So in early 1965, as the war in Vietnam started to heat up, the military began Operation Rolling Thunder, which probably a lot of you are familiar, at least in terms of hearing that expression before. Now, Rolling Thunder was the bombing of North Vietnam. And at that point, at the beginning of this bombing campaign, the Air Force was operating under a certain amount of arrogance, I guess, thinking that they were going to be bombing a third-rate or third-world country, and they were going to have no problem with being able to secure the airspace over North Vietnam. And unfortunately, they were quite a bit surprised by what happened, because the Tactical Air Command did not have any kind of electronic warfare system. They didn't think they needed it. They didn't necessarily believe in it. And they were rudely awakened once they started the bombing campaign, because a lot of aircraft were being lost. At the beginning, they were being lost to radar-guided AAA or anti-aircraft fire. Again, that's in early 1965. So based on that piece of equipment, you can pull this one down. Based on that piece of equipment that there was used in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a company was able to cobble together a pod, which is quite similar to the one behind me here, although this is not the exact same pod. And it was given the designation QRC-160. And QRC stood for Quick Reaction Capability, which was a system by which corporations could create things that the military needed quickly without going through a long process of bidding and putting together contracts. So this pod called the QRC-160 was built and designed. Now, it was originally built and designed for aircraft that were going to presumably bomb the Soviet Union. The idea was that they would put a noise jammer, which was a system which would transmit frequencies at the same frequency that the radars would be trying to transmit, and that would jam them. They would put these on aircraft. This would be a one-way mission for the aircraft. They would fly into the Soviet Union, try to jam the radars, drop their atomic bomb, and that would be the end of that. The pod wouldn't be used again if the plane even existed after they dropped the bomb. So there wasn't a lot of worry about rugged construction and durability and those types of things. Now, these were built specifically for, again, the Strategic Air Command. So in the mid-1965, the Air Force decided to take some of the QRC-160s and move them in country and put them on aircraft in Vietnam to try to jam the Fansong radars. Because again, at this point, the Fansongs are being used to direct AA fire. Now, the military or the Tactical Air Command in particular did not want these pods. They didn't think there was a use for them. And we're going to see that theme go through here a couple times. There was no support given to the pods. They were sent over without technicians. They were sent in country and left to be stored in warehouses. They were oftentimes defective when they were put on aircraft. So there was a lot of different things going on with them beyond the fact that they were not being well supported and that the Air Force did not necessarily want them. But what they did is they tried to put them on, at that time, which was the Air Force's primary surveillance aircraft, which was the RF-101 Voodoo. And they put some of these pods on the Voodoos because they were suffering a particularly high level of shoot down in the AA fire. They put them on the Voodoos, and of course they performed horribly because they were probably broken. Again, there was no support. There was no reason for these pods to work, and they didn't work. In fact, if you want to throw up picture 6. It'll show our friend the RF-101. There we go. So those were used with these QRC-160 pods. The Air Force said, take them back. So the pods were loaded onto aircraft and ships and sent back to the United States. So in April of 1965, so this is only a few months into Rolling Thunder, there were aerial photos taken which clearly showed SA-2 missile sites. If you remember that photo I showed you a few minutes ago, they were clearly showing these SA-2 missile sites in the North. Now, that was not going to bode well for the Tactical Air Command, but they didn't really do anything about it at the time. By July of 1965, those missile sites were up and running, and by July 1965,
listen, I got a Zoom call, a tour of the Electronics Museum here. So, all right.
There we go. Somebody's not
there. All right. Will do. All right. Bye.
If anybody joined recently, please mute yourself, please.
Perfect. So you got to figure 7 months into the air war, they were already casualties as a result of the SA-2 missiles being fired at American aircraft. Now, the way the SA-2 worked, or what they would call its kill chain, was this. There were 2 radars. There was a radar called the spoon rest. Now, the spoon rest was a search radar that would send out a very wide angle beam of energy, and it would scan across the sky looking for particular targets. Once the spoon rest would lock onto a target, that information then would be sent to the second radar, which was the fan song. And I thought this was really interesting. The fan song would have a narrower beam to be able to track the target more accurately. Now, that narrow beam was about a 10-degree beam. So if you were to hold your hand out as far as it would go, about the width of your hand is about 10 degrees straight out. I'm not doing the Nazi salute here, but the width of my hand is about 10 degrees. So the fan song radar could only see the horizon about that distance, and or from here to here in height distance as well. So you can see that the fan song radar by itself would have difficulty finding any aircraft that were flying. Once the spoon rest found them, that information then would go to the fan song. The fan song then could narrow in onto the target. Once it was narrowed in on the target, the information would then be put into a computer. Once the computer decided that the aircraft was in a close enough range to launch, the SA-2 missile then would be launched at the target. Once the missile was launched, the radar would then track the missile and the target together, and radar information would be sent to the missile to direct the missile to the target. Once the target was close to the missile, there would be an uplink and downlink control that would send information to the missile telling it that it was okay, turn on the proximity fuse, which is a tiny radar transmitter inside the nose of the aircraft. So once the missile got close to a target, it would explode, shrapnel would come out in a cloud formation, and that presumably would be close enough to the target that would bring the aircraft down. So the missile didn't necessarily have to hit the target, it would just get very, very close. Now, we're going to try a little sound demonstration here, which is going to be the sound that the guys in the aircraft would hear. They would be able to hear the sound of the radar locking, the sound of the radar searching for them, and then they would hear the sound of the radar actually lock onto their aircraft. Now, there's going to be a voiceover on this, so it's probably going to be a little bit hard for you guys to hear the voiceover, but I just paraphrase it, so don't worry about being able to listen to that part, but listen to the sound of the radar as it locks onto a target.
At the beginning of the Vietnam War, U.S. aircraft were able to bomb North Vietnam with 2 losses. In order to help North Vietnam, the Soviet Union provided North Vietnam with SA-2 surface-to-air missile systems. The SA-2 radar used a low pulse repetition frequency to acquire and track an aircraft. The SA-2 used a high pulse repetition frequency to engage the aircraft. You are going to hear the audio signal a U.S. pilot heard when an SA-2 first tracked his aircraft, and then you will hear the radar tone change, indicating the SA-2 has engaged the aircraft. What you just heard gave the pilot a chance to use his electronic warfare system and maneuver to evade an SA-2 missile. Let's listen to the sound again.
So the voiceover isn't exactly correct. In July of 1965, there would not have been an option to use electronic countermeasures. It simply would have been, hopefully you would have seen the missile as it was launched and give you the opportunity to evade it. The missile wasn't a great flying vehicle, so if you did spot it in time, it would be possible to get away from it so it would not hit you or get close enough to explode. Now, again, in this time frame, middle summer 1965, the Air Force simply tried to avoid bombing areas that had SA-2 missiles. Now, you could fly high to avoid the missiles. It'd give you an opportunity to spot them when they were launched. Of course, then your bombs wouldn't necessarily hit the target because you'd have problems locating a target. The other thing, which is actually even more dangerous than the missile itself, was each one of the missile sites was surrounded by and very sophisticated and very lethal anti-aircraft battery, also being radar operated. So the pilots tried to come in low, they would be forced to fly through a devastating anti-aircraft battery. If they would fly high, they would probably miss their targets. So even though they could be outmaneuvered, the pilots were sort of stuck at this point. Now, in September of 1965, the Air Force held an anti-SA-2 symposium where members of the military and engineering firms got together to try to figure out how to stop the SA-2 scourge from further damaging the Air Force's ability to bomb North Vietnam. Now, interestingly, at this point, United States Air Force colonel who had worked with the QRC-160 and was working on ways to avoid Russian or Soviet radars in the event of an atomic attack, said that if you take the QRC-160 and mount it on aircraft and have those aircraft fly a specific formation, that the number of aircraft with jammers on each aircraft would give the impression of one large aircraft and the missile would miss them. And he was basically ignored and poo-pooed off the stage because the Air Force didn't want to hear the formation flying portion of his argument. Now, at this time, a system called the AN/APR-25, which was an offshoot of that device that they used during the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was mounted into aircrafts. And Sam can swing over and we'll show you what the system looks like right there. Those are the antennas, two circular things, and then the black boxes that were inside of the aircraft. So the APR-25 was a receiver which could pick up the fan song signals, as we heard with the audio display here a second ago. So that's how the pilot would be able to hear that signal. So the pilots could hear the radars being turned on. So in late 1965, the Air Force developed a program called the Wild Weasels. And they put the APR-25 on aircraft with the idea that those aircraft, some of the aircraft would search out the missile batteries and wait for them to turn on those radar antennas and then attack where they heard the signals coming from. Now, on paper, that seemed to be a great option. Initially, it was not necessarily a big success. A lot of aircraft were destroyed trying to attack them because they didn't have a decent system by which to attack the missiles once they located them. They also were trying to use unguided missiles on the aircraft, and they were using just strafing techniques. So they weren't terribly successful. They were also using an aircraft called the F-100, Super Sabre, which wasn't necessarily the best aircraft because of the aircraft's speed and inability to strike these things effectively. So this was, again, late 1965. We're like 1 year into this air war. Now, early 1966, the Air Force was really interested in finding out what that signal was that was downloaded from the missile to the radar and uploaded from the radar to the missile, which would signal the radar or signal the missile that it was time to set the proximity fuse. Now, to be able to get that information, you would have to be close enough to that missile to be hit and destroyed by it. I didn't realize that the Air Force had used drones this early, but they had a drone called the Ryan Firebeam, and these drones were launched over North Vietnam, waiting for the radar operators to target one of the drones. And it took a while, but eventually one of these Ryan Firebees was shot down by an SA-2 missile, but the Firebee had equipment on it which recorded and transmitted signals down to the Air Force handlers. So they were able to listen to and then analyze that signal, that uplink and downlink signal. So now we had another piece of the puzzle, which was how to stop the missile from thinking that it was near a target. So mid-1966, we're now a year and a half into this. The F-100 was replaced with the F-105, which became the classic Wild Weasel aircraft. The F-105 was the primary bombing aircraft of the air war at this time. It enabled a larger payload. The plane was a little bit faster and was able to interact better with the other F-105s, which were bombing, as opposed to used for Wild Weasel. Again, the losses were still pretty bad. They were developing techniques to attack the Fansong radars, but they still lacked a proper missile and really the ability to jam that radar. It was a matter of get the radar to turn on and then try to attack it. Now, the Air Force had gone back and looked at the QRC-160, and they set up a program oddly called Operation Problem Child, which is the title of the talk that I sent you guys. Now, Operation Problem Child was an attempt to figure out if the QRC-160 noise jammer could actually be effective in stopping the SA-2 missiles. So in early February of 1966, the Air Force went back to that colonel who said if the planes fly in formation, they could create a jamming situation that the missile will not be able to overcome. So the Air Force took 4 F-105s and mounted 2 QRC pods on each aircraft. And by doing some calculations, they found that the aircraft would fly in formation, each aircraft slightly higher than the next one, and a certain distance apart. There would be an overlap of their noise jamming signal. So when the radar would lock onto it and then launch the missile, it would get one large signal, but instead of 4 small ones. So the chances of the missile missing all 4 of them was greater because there was still a distance between each individual aircraft. So the missile presumably would fly between the aircraft and the proximity fuse wouldn't be close enough to set it off. They went to the Air Force, again, the Tactical Air Command, and they absolutely hated the idea. They hated the idea of putting pods on planes. Pods were extra weight. Pods didn't blow up. Pods slowed the planes down. The pilots were not willing to fly the formations. They thought that they were more dangerous to the pilots than not flying the formations. So in the summer of 1966, an Air Force general finally said, okay, I am ordering the Tactical Air Force to adopt problem child tests in the field. So in the summer of 1966, a year and a half into the air war, these pods were tried out on a flight of 4 F-105s with no losses. Now, members of the Air Force then started to take notice. Hey, the pilots that have the pods come back every time. There weren't enough pods at this point to go around. Those QRC-160s were not necessarily meant to fly over and over again. They were being sent back to the United States and being rebuilt. Fortunately, the Air Force was able to figure out that if you put one pod on one plane rather than 2 pods on one plane, you still got the same effective use. Now, the one problem with this is those planes would be flying in formation. Now, if any one of those pods malfunctioned, the ability to stop the SA-2 then would be degraded significantly. Every pod that was broken or didn't work, or if those guys didn't stay in formation, made it very easy for the other guys in the formation to be shot down by the missiles. But what Problem Child proved in the summer of 1966 is that this whole situation could be resolved by adding these pods. Now, even though the pods were being used with formation flying, there's still, in the remaining part of the air war, a lot of cat and mouse going on between the Air Force and what the North Vietnamese radar operators were doing. Now, at this point, I forgot to mention that at this point, there was a radiation-seeking missile, that's electromagnetic radiation, not gamma radiation, called the Shrike. Now, the Shrike missile would home in on the Fansong radar, and it would follow the radar beam down to the missile command truck and blow the missile command truck up. So once the Wild Weasels were able to locate the radar, they would launch the Shrike missile. Presumably the Shrike missile would follow the beam down and then blow up the radar. But at least to begin with, the Shrike missile used a fuel that had metal in it. So once the missile was launched from an aircraft, the radar operators on the ground would see a plume on their radar screens, which meant that the missile was on its way to them. So they would simply turn off the radar. Now, with the radar off, the missile couldn't be used, but they would save the radar itself. If there's no radar, there wasn't anything for the Shrike to track on, then the Shrike just became a dead missile. The other thing that the North Vietnamese radar operators would do, because the radar took a little bit of time to warm up. It took about, remember, this is still tube stuff, you know, in the 1960s. It took about 5 minutes for the radar to warm up. So if they kept the radar off and waited until there was a target, turned the radar on, the radar would start to be transmitting that frequency, although it wouldn't be powerful enough to launch the missile. So the North Vietnamese radar operators quickly learned that if they attached dummy loads to the radars, they could keep the radar at full power without transmitting. That way, when they knew there was a target, it was simply a matter of switch it on, track the target, and they could switch it off quickly once the missile was launched and on its way. The other thing that the North Vietnamese did is they moved them. They moved them all the time. The radars were never in the same place at the same time. These things were mobile. They would launch and scoot, launch and scoot. They'd also build fake radars, fake missile batteries. And each one of those fake missile batteries and fake radars would be surrounded by pretty significant anti-aircraft guns, so that if the military, if the Air Force was unfortunate enough to attack one of these fake sites, they still had to deal with the anti-aircraft fire. In fact, they would have to deal with the anti-aircraft fire whether it was fake or not. As later on in this period, towards 1967, the North Vietnamese started putting optical sights on the radar. So once the spoon rest would track a target, send the information to the fan song, they could actually sight using an optical sight, the radar, so they didn't necessarily have to turn the radar on really until the last minute to do the guiding part of the attack. And the last thing is that because these planes were flying in a formation, it gave the North Vietnamese Air Force an easier target to attack. So the North Vietnamese fighters would be sent to the jamming aircraft in particular, knowing that once they broke formation, if they broke formation, not only would they be susceptible to air attack, they'd also be susceptible to attack from the ground. Now, there was a famous, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but there was a famous instance in 1966. It was called Operation Bolo, where a fellow named Robin Olds took some F-4 aircraft and put jamming pods onto the aircraft to simulate aircraft that were meant to jam the radar. And the North Vietnamese fell for it. And a lot of North Vietnamese aircraft were shot down because they thought they were attacking the F-105s when they were actually attacking the main fighter jet of the Air Force at that time, which was the F-4. Now, later on, during the 1966-67 period, the U.S. started integrating chaff, which was aluminum foil, which could be dropped by aircraft, which would simulate a target. Standoff jammers, in other words, jammers put on larger aircraft, which would not necessarily have to fly directly over the radars, were deployed. And also the QRCs were replaced by this thing, which was the Westinghouse ALQ 71, which was designed specifically to be used with the Wild Weasels and to combat the fan song radar. So by 1968, there was a system to work around the radar. We started to get a little bit of an edge in the air war at this period. And as you know, if you know your Vietnamese or Vietnam War history, the air war essentially stopped in 1968. Now, the air war resumed in 1972. Of course, the North Vietnamese at that point had way many more radars, way many more missiles. And the cat and mouse game began in earnest at that point. The SA-2s weren't as successful against the smaller bombers and fighter aircraft, because at that point the countermeasures that we had were improved. Not only were there more radars and missiles for them, but our countermeasures had improved at that point. There were larger flights of aircraft. It became more and more difficult for the SA-2s to make strikes against our aircraft. If you want to throw up picture number 9. This is an aircraft being hit. There we go. These are what this is the SA-3 missile, which we were afraid was going to be introduced at the end of, in 1972, which is a much better missile than the SA-2s. And we started to prepare for that particular missile, but fortunately that missile was not launched. And if you want to back up, I think I missed a couple pictures, my mistake. That's an SA-2 hitting an F-105. Now the missile hasn't actually hit it, but that ball of material is actually the missile blowing up, and it's close enough to the plane to take it down. And then the next picture there is a photo of a strike missile being fired from a Navy A4. The other pod that I want to show you well, at this point, we're going to end the talk on the pods and the relationships between the pods and the radars, because at that point in the war, the Air Force switched over to Linebacker, where they were using B-52s to try to bring the North Vietnamese government to the conference table for peace talks. That's a whole nother story. So at this point, we'll just end at that. So again, the thing to take from this is that all of this cat and mouse back and forth, trying to figure out how to stop these radars, all occurred in a very, very short period of time, from 1965 until 1968. And again, the air war ended essentially for another 5 years and then resumed in 1972. But real quick, a couple of the other pods that we have here that relate to this story. This is the ALQ-101. This particular pod was designed to counteract the SA-3. These were shipped to Vietnam and kept in storage. They did not use them. The SA-3 was never deployed, so these were never deployed in country. The next pod down here is the ALQ-119, which was an improved version of the 71. These were used to a small extent towards the end of the Vietnam War. And this big guy down at the bottom was the ALQ-131. It's had a completely different suite of electronics. And this particular pod, in also some form or another, has been in existence since the end of the Vietnam War through the present. There's an interesting story about this particular pod. This pod was designed to counteract a particular frequency radar that was being used by the Soviets in the early 1970s. And later in the 1970s, as the Soviets changed their radar equipment to different frequencies, they wanted to redesign the ALQ-131 to be able to counteract those different frequency radars. Now they found that the way the antennas are built into the nose of the ALQ-131, it was impossible to change the frequency of the pod to generate the signal out the front of the radar. However, there is an antenna on the rear of the pod which would be able to be used on that frequency. And for a while, what the Air Force did was just take this pod and hang them from the planes upside down and use what was the tail as the front of the pod so that the jam there. So they found that it worked. It still worked pretty well. Flew both forward and backwards just as well. So that's pretty quick, pretty brief. Not a ton of information, but maybe a lot there. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
anybody has a question, just raise your hand. We can. Okay. Joe, you want to turn your audio on?
Mike?
Yeah, you're on.
Yes.
Yeah, Mike, listen, you said earlier that an option for the United States Air Force was to fly higher to avoid the SAM-2s. The range, if that's the right word, of the SAM-2s, I believe was 60,000 feet. Did we have any planes that could fly at that height and be somewhat effective?
No, actually, what I meant, I might not have spoken correctly. By flying higher, it gave the pilots the ability to see the missiles being launched. So it gave them more options to be able to maneuver away from the missiles. At the lower altitudes where the missile was still effective, you didn't have a lot of time once the missile was launched. The Air Force was doing overflights of U-2s and SR-71s, which I doubt the SA-2 could have reached, but presumably the SA-2 did shoot down Gary Powers.
Right. What about the SA-3? What was that capable of?
The SA-3 operated on a completely different frequency. It was a lot more powerful. It was a lot better system. In fact, that would be another story for probably the Israeli Air Force in the late 1970s, early 80s against the Syrians. That radar was being deployed in Europe by the Russians, but it was never sent to Vietnam. If it had been sent to Vietnam, the story would have probably started back over, kind of like it would have been in 1965, at least for a short period of time, until we figure out how to counteract it.
I just have one more question. I don't want to monopolize this, but the operators of the radar sites and the actual SAM-2 missile sites, initially, were they all Soviet Union personnel? Initially.
So what I read was when that first site was discovered in 1965, in the early summer of 1965, Washington told the Air Force not to attack them with the presumption that they probably had Soviet or Chinese operators.
All right, well, how can they tell that?
I don't know. Again, from what I read, is they were worried that if they, killed personnel who weren't from North Vietnam, that it would cause an issue. I can't imagine that there weren't some people killed over the course of the war that were advisors.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about today. I was doing a little research on this, and I'm thinking, we don't know the numbers, but I'm sure, like you said, some of them had to have been killed. All right, I'm done, but this is an interesting topic for me, but go ahead. Let somebody else talk.
I have a question. Hello?
Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
At the end of the war, say by how many SAM missile sites were there in North Vietnam? Do we have a count?
I didn't follow through with once linebacker started, but from what I read from the B-52 crews, they were amazed by the number of missiles being launched. In fact, it's possible that they were just launching missiles, just hoping they would hit something. Because remember, they had 5 years to build up their forces.
I read the same thing today, Mike, that the system, by 1972, the system was the most sophisticated, ever in any war, of course. And was like a blanket. There was so much, you know, anti-aircraft, you know, equipment there.
Now, one other thing that I had heard this, and I had not actually seen it cited, but I did today, is that also by the resumption of the war in 1972, the North Vietnamese Army had shoulder-launched missiles called the SA-7, and the SA-7 was a heat seeker, and they were pretty devastating against the transport planes. And someone had told me this, and again, I didn't necessarily believe it until I saw the citation, is that the Air Force would lower the rear ramps of the C-130s, and there would be a crewman strapped to the ramp with a flare pistol. And if they saw one of the shoulder-launched missiles fired at the aircraft, they would fire flares out the back of the aircraft in hopes that the missile would follow the flares. This was the system they used until they put flame dampers on the engines.
When did the second war end?
Pardon?
The Second Air War, you said, started in 1972. When did it end?
It only lasted until 72. After the Christmas bombings, the North Vietnamese government went to the peace conference, and a peace treaty was signed. We left, and then they invaded.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Mike, that shoulder-fired missile that you're talking about, was that, I hate to say this since it was developed by another country, but was that the forerunner of the Stinger missiles that we supplied during the Afghanistan war?
I can't answer that, but in the photos, they sure look the same.
Because that changed the nature of that war considerably.
Absolutely.
Dave? Yeah, this is Dave Waldrop. I was an electronic warfare officer in B-52s shortly after Vietnam. And fascinating talk. Thank you for bringing this up. To answer the last question, no, the Stinger is much more sophisticated from a seeker head perspective. The SA-7 was pretty rudimentary. Still around, still effective against low altitude targets, slow moving targets. The Stinger has a wider range of intercept capability and a better seeker head. So it's a much more lethal system, the US Stinger, as opposed to the SA-7 called the Grail shoulder launch system.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked about the number of sites. There were hundreds of SA-2 sites in North Vietnam by the time they had the Linebacker 2 missions in December of '72. And yes, they fired so many guideline missiles, actually, I'm sorry, so many of the SA-2 missiles that they were starting to run out. The estimates were thousands over the short period of about 12 days in December of '72 that they were starting to run low on missiles being shot, just throwing them up in the air, some of them guided, some of them not. The thing in the favor of the defenders in North Vietnam was we kept coming in on the same track, same timing. And so the old adage of you're made awake by the first flight, you aim at the second flight, you hit the third, sadly was true in many cases.
So my understanding is that the way the B-52s approached the target, they would actually block their own jamming pods.
The issue is, if you ever look at a picture of a B-52, the jamming antennas are on the bottom of the aircraft. There's a group of them in the front of the aircraft, on the bottom side, in front of the front landing gear truck, and there's another group behind the rear landing gear truck on the bottom side. So when you turn the aircraft, the cone of coverage from those antennas turns with the aircraft, so that yes, you can blank out your own jamming by turning into, yeah, there you go, turning into the site. So one of the biggest helps for the buffs, the B-52s in Vietnam, were the RB-66 and the other dedicated support jamming aircraft that they would stand off and jam with barrage jamming to broadly jam the signal to the SA-2 operators, so it would just white out their scope. And they got more and more sophisticated so that they could see through that jamming. As you get closer to the transmitter, they can actually burn through your jamming. And this is a gross, generalization of how it worked. The short answer is yes, you can turn and blank out your own jamming.
Charles?
Yeah, Rick, I just wanted to point out that the F-105G Wild Weasel is one of our aircraft on display down at the flight line, and you can see the jamming paddle on the side of it.
Yes, that's true. Are there any other questions at this point? Well, thank you very much, Mike. We enjoyed that. And I hope that in the next 6 months or so, the museums will be open and we can come down and visit you and see those odds.
Hopefully it's sooner than 6 months, but if anybody has a hankering to come over, just give me a shout. We can work something out. We're just not open.
But they will take individual persons every once in a while.
Yes, we can make exceptions.
Yes. Well, thank you. And I want to say thanks to everybody for joining us. I think Tom Jones is still on with us. He's going to do our talk next month. Tom, do you want to say a word or two about your talk for next month?
Okay, Ted, you made me get out of my chair. I'll be speaking about the 40th anniversary of the advent of the space shuttle, which took off in 1981 on April 12th for the first time.
Yes.
And so I'm going to talk about the design of the shuttle during the 1970s, some of the technical challenges involved, and then how it all came together with the first flight of the shuttle STS-1 on that April 12th, 1981 anniversary. So we're observing the 40th anniversary of that next month. That's also the day that Yuri Gagarin launched into space 60 years ago. So some good space history to talk about, and I hope you guys will tune in.
Yes, yes. And we'll be in touch with you so that we can work out the details with Rick or whoever's running this show at that time.
Yes, we need to work out the cash transfers that everybody will be sending my way.
Yes, okay, we'll do that.
Bitcoins, we'll use Bitcoins.
Bitcoins, okay.
That makes it easy. There you go.
And we'll be jamming those transmissions.
Hey, Ted.
Don't worry, Tom, checks in the mail.
Okay.
Ted.
Roger, Dub.
Yes, Rick.
I just like to thank Mike and Samantha. Samantha was the technical backup that did all that shooting and everything in there, and of course how hard did Mike worked to work all this up. It takes a lot of more than a little bit of coordination between their museum and our museum and what they're doing and what we're doing here, but it all worked out really well. So thank you very much. Good job. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Good presentation, Mike.
As everybody says. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We'll see some of you on Wednesday at